in order to improve the world, we're going to have to take seriously the legacies of the past.
Hi, welcome to Inside Science Conversations. I'm your host, Chris Gorski. I'm the senior editor at Inside Science, a science news website supported by the American Institute of Physics. This is a show about what makes scientists tick, about how their brains work. And today on the show, we have an interview with James Poskett, a historian of science and technology at the University of Warwick. James has written a book that comes out on March 22nd called Horizons, The Global Origins of Modern Science. As the subhead describes it, it is indeed a story about how people from around the globe contributed to scientific knowledge over time and how that a lot of those stories have been lost in many ways. And the full story is so much more interesting. James, thanks for joining me.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So one of the reasons we wanted to talk, of course, is you have a new book coming out.
Yep.
Horizons, The Global Origins of Modern Science. And it's pretty broad. How did you decide you wanted to write this kind of book?
Yeah, thank you. So the breadth is what motivated me. I was kind of frustrated with the history of science as it sat at the moment, where there were quite a few quite local or national histories of science, and those tended to be very much focused on Europe and the United States and this story about the origins of modern science in particularly Europe. And I really wanted to write a much broader history of science that connected up the world. And as the title, the argument of the book is in the title. It's about the global origins of modern science, that the classic narrative of the origins of modern science in early modern Europe with the scientific revolution, that this narrative really is a bit of a myth, to be honest, as I put it in the book, and that instead we can think about all the different ways in which people and cultures from outside of that standard history focusing on Europe contributed to the making of modern science.
Well, it's really compelling and told me so many stories that I didn't quite realize I had overlooked along the way. I'm really curious about how you kind of, how you saw yourself as a 10 or 12-year-old, maybe. What kind of things did you think you would be doing? Was it historian? Was that where you were looking?
Great question. People don't ask me this very much. So yeah, I'm a professional historian today. I work in the history department at a university. I teach, world history, not just the history of science. When I was a child, I wanted to develop computer games, as it happened, and I loved computer games, and I loved science, actually. So I didn't think I'd be a historian. I wasn't very interested in history at all at school, actually. I dropped it as soon as you were allowed to. And I began a degree in computer science, actually. So I started my degree in computer science thinking I wanted to develop computer games, or at least work in the tech kind of industry. This was before it kind of all blew up as well. So maybe I should have stayed. I'd be a lot richer if I'd stayed in that, but maybe not as happy. I was always interested in more the philosophy of science, actually, as well. So when I got to university, I started taking modules, and I was lucky enough studying at Cambridge that there was a separate department for the history and philosophy of science. So I moved into that as I went through the degree and really fell in love with it, and fell in love with the philosophical and the historical and more the political aspects of science really gripped me. So I moved from kind of computer scientist to philosophy of science, and then all the way through to history of science, and now just history. And I think that is reflected in the book actually quite a lot, in that it's not just about the technical aspects of science. I try and treat the science seriously, and I have that scientific background. I took the physics and maths and biology exams at Cambridge, but I try and inject a lot of serious world history into it. So it's about, the colonization of the Americas, the growth of the Atlantic slave trade, the Industrial Revolution, the communist revolutions of the 20th century, and so on. So I take the history as seriously as the science.
I think a lot of the history of science books that I'm familiar with are, biographies of single people, or maybe of a decade of massive change, right? So it's really interesting to, this isn't about Heisenberg or Oppenheimer or Mendeleev, right? It's about all of them and everything that influenced them, and so much more, right? But one of the things that, as I'm reading it, just kind of really struck me is the concept that as Columbus came to the Americas and other explorers, it was those things that they brought back, the tomatoes, the potatoes, the astronomy, that changed how people looked at how Europeans rather looked at the world and science. I mean, is that something that's been building in the field, or is that a synthesis that you're creating? How is that kind of story coming together?
Yeah, I'm really pleased you picked up on that. So the book sort of starts in the historical moment of Columbus in the Americas, as you say. And the book isn't just about scientific discoveries, it's also about the meaning of science and how that was radically transformed, which is what you're describing. And for Europeans, they had long relied and placed a lot of emphasis on ancient knowledge, and that everything worth discovering you could discover by reading the works of classical and ancient authors like Aristotle. And the discovery and colonization of literally a new world sort of challenged that in quite a fundamental way. And it wasn't just that you're right, they found all these new things that they didn't know about. Obviously, the indigenous people of the Americas were perfectly familiar with potatoes and tomatoes. And that was interesting in its own right, but that also made Europeans start thinking much more about, well, how should we do science? And of course, the classic metaphor is one of discovery. People talk about making scientific discoveries today. And that metaphor has its origins in exactly that period where people like the English philosopher Francis Bacon literally made that direct comparison, saying the regions of the known geographical world have opened up. We now know there are more things, and this kind of world of discovery needs to be mirrored in the understanding of the natural and physical world. So that's something in the case of the Americas, historians of science have been quite aware of over the last, I'd say, like couple of decades. I think the synthesis I really tried to show in the book was this wasn't actually just a European thing, and it wasn't just about the Americas. And that's, I think, the difference between the history I've written and some of the academic history of science as it exists today. So I go on in the next few chapters of the book to show that actually other cultures around the world had a kind of similar reconfiguration of how they thought about knowledge when they encountered other cultures. So I talk about Ming Dynasty China and what they thought was happening when they encountered Jesuit astronomers from Europe coming to China, to Beijing. And they often kind of said similar things about that this was a way in which to access new knowledge from afar, that maybe this was a way to reconceptualize ancient knowledge in a new way. And so I trace this history of what I call a scientific renaissance, actually, around the world, where all different kinds of cultures, between around 1500 and 1700, cultural exchange, particularly global cultural exchange, seems to be this real driver for making people think differently about science and knowledge.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the, I guess, assumptions I had was that the global collaboration in science, global kind of back and forth, was really growing. But the stories in the book explain how much of that was going on. I was not aware of all the things happening kind of along the Silk Road, especially with astronomy from Samarkand to India and more. What stands out about that kind of astronomy to you?
In a way, I sometimes like to think that Europe was weird not because it was modern and connected, but Europe was weird because it was especially unmodern and unconnected, and then kind of was at really a middle point of a much longer history from the year maybe like 1000 onwards, where the world was becoming interconnected. So you're right, there are all these connections between particularly the massive Islamic world of the early modern period, the late medieval period, stretching all the way from Beijing, where there's a Muslim astronomical contingent at the observatory there, through, as you say, India to northern India with the Mughals and the astronomers there, through Persia, through what's now Uzbekistan, but Samarkand, all the way through the Ottoman Empire, and indeed to West Africa as well. And I think, to answer your question about what stands out, for me, one of the things I was really pleased I was able to do, but took a lot of work, was to integrate that story of pre-colonial West African science into this history of the scientific revolution. Because even in academic work, it basically doesn't figure. There's a sort of limited acknowledgement that there was some kind of mathematical or astronomical tradition in West Africa, in places like Timbuktu in modern day Mali, but that's never talked about as part of the same story of the scientific revolution, or the kind of transformation in Islamic astronomical and mathematical sciences that were happening north of the Sahara. And what I show in the book is that, unsurprisingly, like the Silk Road was running from West Africa all the way to East Asia, and those astronomers and mathematicians in West Africa, in Timbuktu, in Kano, in what's modern Nigeria, they were reading, critiquing earlier, often Arabic, Islamic works on astronomy and mathematics particularly. And they were just as much part of that story as elsewhere. So that's the thing that stood out to me. I guess the other big thing is the presence of these astronomical observatories.
Right. And they're pretty stunning in size and scale, right?
Yeah, many of them still exist, right?
Yeah, I was actually lucky enough to go to Jaipur and go to the Jantar Mantar there. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, I include a few, even my own photos. My publisher was probably very pleased because some of the images in the book, I took when I visited, particularly the Jantar Mantar of Varanasi in northern India.
A lot of the story of science, when you learn science in school, is smoothed out, right? They don't tell you the exceptions to the rules until much later, right? I think perhaps it's kind of similar with the history in some ways, because you've got this story of a succession of geniuses, right? Copernicus, Newton, Einstein, right? Basically all Western, but can you tell me a little bit about how some of those people were taking in a lot of other texts and other information to help take it one step farther than anyone had before? Like that's the way I think of it anyway.
100%. So you're right. There is this narrative of the lone genius scientist, and the names you said are exactly the ones that pop up, right? Newton, Darwin, earlier Copernicus, Einstein. And that was really a narrative that developed really in the 20th century to try and create this image of the scientist as the rational individual that fitted very much with the Cold War mindset in the West and the United States in particular, obviously. As you say, this was not the case, basically. All these individuals, and they acknowledged it at the time. None of the history I tell would have been a surprise to anyone in the early modern period. They were quite happy to acknowledge their debts to earlier thinkers, including those from outside Christian and European cultures. So Copernicus, it's not hidden. He cites 5 different Islamic authors on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. He was steeped in a culture where people were continually reading and critiquing and developing ideas based off Arabic manuscripts. Copernicus himself couldn't read Arabic, but he was taught by people that could. He could also read Hebrew, so he would have been able to read some of the Byzantine Greek text. So he draws particularly on this very influential earlier Islamic astronomer called Nasr al-Din al-Tusi to solve a technical astronomical problem about why it is that the planets wobble, basically. So they circle the sun, but they don't circle in perfect circles. And this earlier Islamic technique, Copernicus was able to draw on. Similarly, plenty of later thinkers, Newton happily acknowledged. I mean, Newton famously said that everyone knows I don't make any observations myself. And, that standing on the shoulders of giants kind of quote, he meant it. Like, that was the way in which science was done in the early modern period, by collating all different kinds of work from all different kinds of sources and creating this kind of synthesis. It wasn't just about observation. And you see that right through, like throughout the 19th century, even the 20th century, this kind of work of cultural synthesis continues to be a core part of science that was swiftly forgotten from the 1950s onwards.
While you're putting this together, what are some of the stories were there any stories that you had to leave out that you desperately wanted to include?
Yeah, there's stories I left out that I didn't desperately want to include. So one of the challenges of writing this book is I was aware people were going to say, what about so-and-so? And what about so-and-so in the traditional European traditions? Like, where's Galileo? Where's this, that, and the other? And I was very conscious that, I couldn't tell the old story if I wanted to tell the new story. In terms of people, places I didn't kind of address as much, I would have liked to write more about modern 20th century African science. So I was very conscious about talking about pre-colonial Africa, that the history of modern science doesn't begin with slavery and colonialism. And then I talk about slavery and colonialism and the place of science there. Later on, I did quite a lot of research into things like African mathematicians, African physicists in the 20th century. And part of the balancing act of the book was just to balance all these different places and regions against one another. In the end, I put more of that in the conclusion. So I have quite a contemporary discussion of Africa about AI and mathematics and computing to talk about the ways in which post-colonial African science is really important for understanding not just the history of science, but science today, and lots of the politics of science today, vis-a-vis particularly China and the US.
I guess a lot of this, more than I realized, is politically motivated or tied. As one of the things that I also caught my eye, because it wasn't the way I'd thought about something before, was the idea that referring to an Islamic kind of golden age of science had consequences and has. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about what you say in the book about how that places it in the past.
Yeah, so this is as you say, we hear a lot actually, and we have in the last few decades about golden ages of science. So particularly in the Islamic golden age, the medieval period, in which there were incredible advances in the sciences in the Islamic world, things like alchemy, algorithm, particularly in astronomy, all these developments. And that's all absolutely true. This was an important time of scientific advance, of course. Similarly with ancient China, the compass, gunpowder, etc. Similarly, actually, with ancient and medieval Hindu science often gets kind of invoked. I always tell my students, if you hear the term golden age, you should immediately be suspicious because it has built into it a decline kind of narrative. So yes, there was an Islamic advance of science, but it didn't suddenly fall off a cliff in the early modern period. And indeed, that narrative served a very specific political goal. It was really invented in the late 18th and early 19th century as European empires expanded into the Islamic world, first in Egypt, also in India and North India with the Mughals, later in the Ottoman territories. And it served a quite simple purpose, which was to portray the Islamic world as a once glorious civilization, but one that was now degraded and needed modern Europe to become civilized and modern again. And so it has this very clear, almost propaganda purpose in the 19th century. And what I show in the book is basically that's not true, that Islamic science didn't disappear suddenly in 1400, that it continued to develop and advance and contribute to modern science in a variety of different ways. And indeed, right up until the Ottoman, including the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman modernizers are very keen on science, and they have this vision of a kind of modern Islam tied to modernized science and technology, with the telegraph coordinating the times of prayer. So there's massive interest in the sciences and technology throughout the Islamic world, including in the modern period. I can see why it's appealing, at face value, that narrative. Of course, it can provide role models, but I think it is a problem if the role models are all in the ancient and distant past, and we don't have an account also of the successes of science in the Islamic world in the more recent past too.
So much of the story of science seems to be about navigation, right? From the stars to maps to the seas. The Polynesians, the stories about the Polynesians and the navigator who came with Cook, those stories are extraordinary. Some of the ways that you describe the Polynesians understanding navigation and hints in the waves of what's going on are, could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So another big theme of the book is actually the importance of indigenous peoples and indigenous knowledge to the making of modern science. And as you say, that comes up particularly with astronomy. And when I talk about Newtonian science, I talk a lot about how efforts to verify Newton's claims essentially involved traveling around the world to make observations. But both the travel and the observations absolutely relied on indigenous navigational and astronomical knowledge. How else were Europeans going to navigate around the vast expanse of the Pacific except with the help of people that had been doing it for centuries, if not thousands of years in some cases? Similarly, in South America, the Peruvian indigenous people are really fundamental to the voyages that are made and the astronomical observations that are made, because they have a very long tradition drawing on the earlier Inca Empire of astronomical work. In the Pacific, there's this Polynesian priest, actually, kind of priest navigator called Tapaya, that James Cook, the famous explorer, recruits basically in Tahiti. And Tapaya helps Cook navigate around the Pacific and as far as New Zealand and ultimately Australia. And the ways in which Polynesians navigated was radically different to that of Europeans. And it made absolute sense for navigating around the Pacific. Up until then, Europeans had mainly been used to navigating around smaller seas like the Mediterranean, and then across the Atlantic as well. Later, the Indian Ocean is obviously a bigger expanse. But navigating around the Pacific, the vastness of it requires a different technique. And broadly, Polynesian navigators followed the stars. They followed star routes, star maps, and they memorized these. They didn't actually write down the directions, and they didn't produce maps as we would know them. Instead, they kind of followed a set of directions that were determined by the sailing towards individual stars and then at certain times changing direction. They'd also follow the swells of the waters. They had a very, very well-developed understanding of tides, waves, currents, at a time actually when Europeans were very much confused about the nature of tides. And Newton spent a lot of time being very confused about and trying to work out what the deal was with tides. So they combine these much more practical and tacit ways of understanding both the stars and the landscape to incredible effect, basically. It was very effective. And the interesting bit for me is that Cook gets Tapaya to draw this map in the more European tradition. So that Polynesian knowledge through this contact was translated into a sort of Europeanized map of the Pacific. And so again, it's not Like when you just look at the artifact, okay, actually this one does have Tupai's name on it, but the artifacts we're left with, the kind of end result of science, often obscures all the individuals, all the cultural processes that went into its production.
The story of how botanical gardens kind of led the way was kind of a really interesting one. What happened with botanical gardens and collections of plants from around the world that were then analyzed and studied for what they had to do with medicines or foods or anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess there's botanical gardens are a really neat example for my argument, because on the one hand, they're absolutely a product of European colonial expansion, that they are explicitly established both back in Europe as kind of treasuries of all these collections, but also in the colonial world in places like colonial India and Kolkata, in the Cape Colony in South Africa and Jamaica and so on, as experimental stations to test out which plants could be grown for economic purposes, to extract more from the colonial economy. So there's that world history story. There's also there's no way you're going to be able to know anything about the plants of South Asia unless you ask people that are there. It's the kind of running theme of the book, really, that of course, when Europeans were confronted with the diversity of the flora and fauna of somewhere like India, they quite swiftly realized that they would need to enlist or coerce often the expertise of local people who had been studying, often writing, particularly in South Asia, about these plants, who had been classifying them, who had been recommending their various medicinal uses. And again, that's something that gets erased in the process, quite often quite deliberately erased in the process of collecting and classifying and creating these gardens. But when historians start looking back at the paper trail, we can see that, for instance, the major works of early modern botany on South Asia, particularly those done by the Dutch East India Company, were absolutely reliant on the knowledge of existing South Asian medicinal healers, classificatory schemes, even South Asian books, palm leaf manuscripts I talk about.
Do you have a favorite anecdote or particular scientist that you discuss in the book?
Yeah, so I deliberately wrote the book about quite a few individuals to kind of give the texture of their life. The Indian physicists of the 20th century and their involvement with the anti-colonial movement, I find the politics of that really interesting. Many of them ended up turning to physics because they were in some way unable to advance within the colonial state and the colonial bureaucracy, often to do with racism or often because of their direct involvement in the anti-colonial movement. And so I'm very interested in the politics of science. And some of those anti-colonial Indian scientists, people like Meghnad Saha, people like Sachendranath Bose, they articulated why science was so important to their politics in a way that became quite is very rare in the 20th century, at least in the West, and is very rare even today. And I find that exciting and kind of exemplary in some ways.
Can you explain a little bit more about how they tied their science to their politics?
Yeah, of course. So both Meghnad Saha and Sachendranath Bose were, in the early 20th century, involved in an anti-colonial movement called the Swadeshi movement, which was in short a movement to boycott British goods in order to break the economic dependency of colonial India on the British Empire. They were actively involved in that. They also saw science as part of Swadeshi, basically. And they thought that it was really fundamental that Indian scientists should be trained, should advance, should teach science in order to break the dependency on India in terms of scientific training as well. And so many of them go to Britain to train. But then they returned to India with this idea that they need to do science in order to break this dependency. And they then push it a little bit further, because both Meghnad Saha and Sachendranath Bose were interested in the new physics of the 20th century, basically. They were super keen on like quantum mechanics, very keen on relativity and Einstein's theories, and basically they were keen on German science. And they explicitly saw their interest in German science as a way to break away from the quite old, by that point, traditions of British science that had been taught ad nausea in colonial Indian universities, learning about the Maxwell equations, learning about Thomson and the laws of thermodynamics, etc., etc. So they saw the radicalism of this new German science, quantum mechanics, relativity, and they turned to that. So it's a bit like, you boycott the British cotton goods, but you also kind of boycott the British science and turn towards this new and exciting German science. And the smoking gun here is that Saha and Bose produced the first in the world English translation of Einstein's Theories of Special and General Relativity, the book. And so it was in India that these Indian anti-colonial nationalists are translating German science into English as part of their movement, rather than, English scientists just read it in German. It wasn't translated into English in England much later. And for me, I just find that a really stark example of just how much politics does shape science, and how much the world beyond Europe, and in this case, even the world beyond Britain, really mattered. This is a history of how India, Britain, Germany, all these connections, and these individuals were writing to Einstein too. Bose and Einstein wrote to one another and collaborated later.
Yeah, that's really, really something. And I think those dynamics aren't really, they're still going on, right? I think so much science today is published in English, which puts its own pressure on things, while a lot of the papers are coming from other countries. So I'm curious about how you think about the future of science based on these narratives and changes that you've seen in writing this book.
Yeah, your point about the English language is a really, really pertinent one. And I know there's been lots more discussion about that in the scientific community recently. English is this global language because of both the history of the British Empire and then later the United States kind of hegemony in the Cold War. And what that means for scientists in other places around the world, scientists whose first language isn't English, or indeed don't speak or write in English. And I think we will see that start to change to an extent, particularly with the rise of China and Chinese science. A lot of what the Belt and Road program, part of the Belt and Road program, is to increase provision for Chinese language training in places like Pakistan, in East Africa. And that actually models a longer history of kind of communist language training programs. The Soviet Union was doing that in the 20th century. They were training Ghanaian scientists in teaching them Russian. So I think the languages of science is something that is really open. In terms of the broader future of science, I make a claim at the end of the book, and I really meant it, that the future of science does depend on understanding its global history. And what I meant by that was that after the end of the Cold War in the 90s and early noughties, the broad idea was that we didn't really need to do anything we didn't really have to engage with history anymore. The world would just get better. And that included the world of science. The world of science would get more diverse, it would get more fair. Turns out that wasn't true, right? We're alive today in 2022, and the world didn't get more fair, it didn't become more equal, it didn't become more multicultural, it became more sharply polarized. And I think there's a new recognition amongst many people, including those, I guess, of my generation, that in order to improve the world, we're going to have to take seriously the legacies of the past. And so a lot of the book is about, the positive aspects of global cultural exchange, but a lot of the book is actually about some pretty dark themes. It's about how things like capitalism and slavery, indigenous genocide, political fraughtness, colonialism, war have shaped the making of modern science. And I think a much greater public awareness of that is an important starting point for answering questions that are often asked but relatively divorced from history, like how do we improve diversity in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics? Well, you need to understand the history of exactly why that diversity is not there today. And in different contexts, it's different, but there's broadly a history of things like slavery, racism, colonialism that help explain that. So that's part of it. The other part is what I call the new Cold War. And I think what happens next with regards to the kind of global ambitions of China and Chinese science vis-a-vis US science is going to be really important. I think a lot of people acknowledge that, but what I try to remind readers, I guess, is that isn't just a bipolar story, that the rest of the world also matters for thinking about Chinese and American science in the years going forward, that places like India, places particularly actually sub-Saharan Africa, which has seen a massive explosion in scientific investment in terms of actually the growth of the middle class. Those are going to be really important places for thinking about the future of science, not just is the future of science in the US or China. We've seen massive scientific investment elsewhere as well. And there's a kind of broad recognition that science is super important to the future of geopolitics. But I want people's attention to be directed beyond the big players, I guess, as well.
Right. I mean, that fits really well into the theme of the book as well, right?
Yeah. It's not by coincidence.
Right. And so what's, now that you've written a spanning, a very far-reaching history of global science, what's next for you?
I'm working on sort of two projects. So one is a history of science after empire. So I realized writing this book that there is much more work to be done on thinking about how the end of European empires shaped the development of science and the relationships between particularly places like Britain and science in other states, but around the world. So I'm thinking about how the process of decolonization shaped both the process of science, but actually scientific lives and careers. I have a PhD student at the minute who's working on the oral history of South Asian scientists in the post-war period and their experiences coming to Britain and returning to South Asia, particularly India. So that's a big theme. After writing this, I did think, I've written this 500, 600 year history. Do I have to go bigger again? When does it stop? I'm only in my 30s. Like, there's only so much I can do. That said, I have toyed with the idea of going back a bit further. So thinking about Valerie Hansen wrote this great history book called The Year 1000, and about how the year 1000 was this important moment in globalization. And I started to think a lot more about how the story I've told could be applied to earlier periods as well. So I chose to focus on this period from 1500 onwards because that's the classic story of the origins of modern science, the scientific revolution. So I needed to kind of start with that, to flip it on its head, to start with the thing people are familiar with. But I'm wondering about, ancient global science or medieval global science and how that might change our understanding of the development of science over the really long term. So yeah, I'm doing a bit of both, smaller and bigger.
Well, that sounds wonderful. I'm looking forward to reading that too, James. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I really, really appreciate it. And it was really nice to have a chat, talk about the book. Comes out March the 22nd in the US. Horizons, Global Origins of Modern Science.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Inside Science Conversations. If you like this episode, please like and subscribe on YouTube or your podcast platform of choice. We'll have another episode of Inside Science Conversations for you soon. I'm Chris Gorski. Thanks.